This is Trump on Earth. I'm Kara Holsapple. So you might have heard that there was an election, and it was a midterm like no other. It was hyped in the media for weeks in advance, like a feature film. The drama of big Senate seat showdowns like Texas and Florida, the anticipation of a surge of voters at the polls, and the controversial starring role of someone who wasn't even on the ballot.
Candidates who embraced our message of low taxes, low regulations, low crime, strong borders, and great judges excelled last night. They excelled.
Trump's job performance and policies were front and center in many races across the country, whether candidates were for or against them. And the environment was on the ballot too. In some cases, literally.
At least 9 states have proposals that are focused on environmental issues. In Colorado, it's a limit to fracking close to rivers and playgrounds. In Arizona and Nevada, it's an initiative that would require 50% of energy to be renewable by 2030. On Tuesday, the fate of offshore drilling.
To get a post-election take on how environmental issues played into the midterm elections and what's next, I talked to George Cahlink. He's a congressional reporter for E&E News. And I caught up with him at the Capitol the day after the election. He was at the Senate covering the first post-election press conference by Nancy Pelosi, who hopes to be Speaker of the House again now that the House has flipped to a Democratic majority.
We're concerned about what's happening at EPA, for example, to degrading of the air we breathe and the water we drink, despite what the president said today. So that's only one example.
And right now we have just about the cleanest air, the cleanest water we've ever had, and it's always going to be that way. We insist on it. So environmental is very important to me. And with that, I'll take a few questions if you'd like. Whoa.
That's coming up in a minute.
That was a lot of hand shooting up so quickly. There's a lot to talk about.
Hi, this is Gloria Rudolph, mother of Trump on Earth co-host Reed Frazier. I support Trump on Earth through Patreon, and I hope you will too. Just go to patreon.com/TrumpOnEarth. It's a great way to help the podcast out. Thanks, and back to the podcast.
Take 2 success.
Okay, we're back, and here's my conversation with E&E News reporter George Cahlink. Well, let's talk about climate change first. Washington state voters rejected Initiative 1631, which was a ballot question that could have established the first carbon tax in the U.S.
My son has asthma, and when it hits, it breaks my heart. Pollution can bring on an attack, so I'm supporting Initiative 1631. It puts a fee on
and it would have put a $15 a ton fee on carbon in the state. And I understand that a lot of money was thrown at this from the fossil fuel industry.
How would I-1631's new energy tax affect your family? Washington families and consumers would pay more than $2.3 billion in higher energy costs for gasoline and heating fuel. And on top of that, hundreds
What do you make of this?
Well, it doesn't seem like carbon tax is going anywhere fast. This is the third time in 3 years this was rejected, so there just hasn't been a groundswell of support for this amongst the general public. We also saw here on Capitol Hill there was an effort earlier this year by some environmentally minded Republicans who joined with Democrats to try to pass a carbon tax, and that didn't sell well either. So I just think it's a very tough sell to convince voters. I think a lot of voters and a lot of people care about the environment, but when it comes to saying things like, hey, are you willing to accept a tax that will ultimately impact you, whether it's on you directly or on services or products that you use, I think that's a much harder sell, and I think that's what we're seeing with these referendums. I think the supporters of it believe that they're educating people by offering this, and they're hopeful that as more attention is focused on climate change, then perhaps the day will come for a carbon tax.
A lot of people were saying that if this couldn't happen in Washington, which is like a more environmentally conscious, supposedly, place, then, what kind of hope would it have anywhere else in the country?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think the interesting thing, though, is that with Democrats taking back the House, I do think you are going to see some renewed focus on climate change from Congress, and that could raise the issue to the public more. For example, House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi, who is expected to be a candidate for Speaker, said that she'd like to bring back a select panel on climate change in the next Congress. That was in place the last time Democrats controlled Capitol Hill and held hearings on climate change that ultimately helped lead to cap-and-trade legislation. It was disbanded when Republicans took over, but Democrats wanted to bring that back. So those types of things could build support for it and maybe down the line momentum for state ballot initiatives like the one we saw defeated in Washington yesterday.
Climate change was also an issue in the Florida Senate race. There was a lot of finger-pointing by Republican Governor Rick Scott, who was running for Senate, and at this recording is the presumed winner, though I think they're going to recount those ballots.
Right.
Finger-pointing over the red tide, the algae on the ocean, and the green lake algae.
Right.
And he blamed his opponent, Bill Nelson, instead of water treatment policies and climate change.
Washington politician Bill Nelson made a pledge 30 years ago to solve this problem. But Nelson's a talker, not a doer. With Bill Nelson, we get more waiting, more talk, and more algae.
I'm Rick Scott. I don't wait for Washington, and I approve this message.
How big a role did the environment and climate change play in the midterms in Florida, which, of course, is a state facing sea level rise, big storms, flooding?
Well, first of all, just broadly, I saw some data yesterday from AP's VoteCast that I think said 7% of voters ranked climate change, environment as their top issue. That's a pretty low number. More voters were concerned about health care, the economy, security type of issues. So nationally, I don't think it played huge. In a place like Florida, I do think the red tide and the algae issues were a concern for voters, but it really kind of became a blame game. Scott's argument was largely, hey, Bill Nelson, you've been there for 3 terms. Why couldn't you have done more to help us prepare for this? Trying to sort of push the blame on him. Conversely, I think Nelson made the same argument again that Scott's environmental policies had done nothing to prevent it. He wasn't acting quickly enough. And I think we saw where voters came down on that, in that a Republican appears to have been elected to the Senate from Florida. And we also saw a Republican elected to the governorship in Florida. So I think to the extent that environmental issues played in Florida, they favored Republicans, and it was more of a, blame game type issue than I think a real substantive argument over policy.
Do you think that's because voters don't necessarily see the link between, the issues that are important to them, healthcare, security, and climate change?
I think that's a great point. I think that voters, when you talk about climate change in the abstract, it can seem like a big issue to people. Well, the Earth's warming, what does that mean? Does it mean just, we might have some warmer winters or a few more hurricanes every year? Voters don't necessarily understand the link, but when you tie it to, hey, because of climate change, sea level's rising, so if you live along the coast, that could impact your property. Or if you tie it to emissions in the air that cause global warming are also creating health problems in your local community, more cases of asthma, things like that. I think that impacts voters. And when you talk to environmental advocates, that's really an argument that they prefer to make. They prefer to personalize it so that people can understand it. When people can understand it and see the real world impacts of it, they're much more likely to want action on it.
Well, as a ballot initiative, Florida did vote to ban offshore drilling and vaping at indoor workplaces. Those 2 things were coupled, which has a lot of us outside of Florida scratching our heads.
Yeah, I think, it is an interesting coupling for sure. But I also think that Florida, has long had strong opposition to offshore drilling. We saw, I think it was the start of this year when the Trump administration proposed expanded offshore drilling program all over the country. There was some big pushback from Florida, especially from Rick Scott, who was the governor, and the Interior Secretary Ryan Zinke immediately said, okay, we'll take care of Florida. They're exempted from this, but for a few existing areas in the Gulf that have long had that. So I think that's an issue that's always had appeal to Florida voters, and I suspect the idea was that if you tied vaping to that, that just makes it stronger.
Of interest to other states that have fracking, like Pennsylvania, where we're based, there was a referendum on new restrictions on the oil and gas industry in Colorado, which failed to pass. And it would have doubled drilling operation setbacks from homes and would also have set aside land that couldn't be touched by oil and gas. And the former and the newly elected Democratic governor of the state were both against it. You know, I guess, is it a surprise that it was defeated? And what does it signal for how government is dealing with the industry?
You know, there was a group called Protect Colorado that was formed to oppose this issue, and they really made it about economics.
I'm Gary Arnold with Pipe Fitters Local 208. I'm a sixth-generation Coloradan, and I care deeply about our state.
That if you go forward with this, there's a chance that will hurt the economy, hurt funding for schools and public safety, because companies aren't going to want to come and locate in a state that has these strict environmental regulations.
Please join us in defeating 112, keeping Colorado's workforce and economy healthy.
I think that's why you saw some bipartisan pushback on it, because it became seen as an economic issue, not simply a matter of preserving lands.
What about big races in energy states like North Dakota, where Heitkamp lost to Kramer, and Texas, where O'Rourke lost to Ted Cruz?
You know, North Dakota was really interesting. A ton of energy money flowed into that state. Heidi Heitkamp got a tremendous amount of money from energy companies, several $100,000, which is notable for a Democrat. But she was viewed as somebody who was very much willing to work with energy companies and a moderate who could help do things like, for example, helping getting the ban lifted on oil exports. However, her opponent, Kevin Kramer, is even more closely tied to the energy industry. He was President Trump's energy advisor during the 2016 presidential campaign. He served as a surrogate for Trump on the trail in debating Hillary Clinton's energy advisor. And he was a former state utilities regulator, so he has a ton of background on energy issues. He's seen as very closely allied with the energy interests in the state. Harold Hamm, one of the leading frackers in North Dakota, was the chairman of Kramer's campaign. So I'd suspect that in Kramer you'll see somebody who's very pro-fracking, very anti any increased regulation of that, and is somebody that those energy companies really feel will hear them out when they have concerns about regulations or other problems they're having with the federal government. And in Texas, that's interesting too. You have Ted Cruz, who again aligned with traditional Texas oil interests. It's the nation's leading energy state. And I think in Beta you had somebody who certainly ran as a progressive, who was willing to take on some of those interests. He didn't quite make it, so obviously that sort of stays status quo in Texas.
But the race was very close.
It was very close, but again, Cruz ultimately won, so I don't think it changes many minds. And you know, in a lot of ways in Texas, when you look at a lot of the House members too, energy issues have a bit of a bipartisan sheen to them, if you will, in Texas. You know, because it's really tied to jobs in the energy sector. There's plenty of Democratic lawmakers who are willing to support the energy industry interests in Texas because it's tied to jobs that their constituents have.
Were there other races that you were watching closely?
You know, there were two interesting races out west that I went out and covered 2 weeks ago, energy ballot initiatives. One was in Arizona where Tom Steyer, who's a very wealthy multimillionaire who's prioritized climate change.
Billionaire.
Yeah, billionaire, fair enough. He spent about $20 million in Arizona to get a ballot question placed on the ballot that would have mandated the state get half of its energy from renewable sources by 2030.
But this November, we can break the machine by choosing clean, affordable energy like wind and solar. And with more untapped solar power than any other state, Arizona will save billions while creating more good-paying jobs. Vote yes for clean, affordable energy for Arizona.
That failed despite him spending close to $20 million. The final figures aren't in. But on the other side was the Arizona Public Services Company, the state's largest utility, which spent over $20 million to defeat this. Again, they were worried that putting this mandate through would add to their costs, force them to sell some traditional power plants. And their argument that was very effective with consumers was, if you adopt this, your prices are going to go up.
My kids come first. I make sure they have what they need and save where I can. Clipping coupons, watching for clearance sales, you know the routine. But now, we hear Prop 127 will double what we pay for electricity each month. That's money we don't have. Listen, I'm all for clean energy, but this is ridiculous. Vote no on Prop 127.
Then in Nevada, there was a ballot initiative that an astounding amount of energy money was spent on. It was a proposal to basically Nevada Energy as the state's single power utility, and it would have restructured or in effect regulated that market by allowing other companies to come in and offer consumers power.
Right now, Nevada gets only 20% of our electricity from renewable sources like solar and wind. Question 6. We'll raise that to 50% by 2030, creating more good jobs and cleaner air. Yes on 6 is simply the only way to guarantee more clean energy.
More than $100 million in spending on this energy ballot initiative, which is just astounding. I mean, that's more money than spent on a lot of Senate races. And on one side was Nevada Energy, which is owned by Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway company. They spent about $63 million to protect their monopoly. And on the other side was Sheldon Adelson, the billionaire casino owner from Las Vegas, who was spending because he was frustrated that some of his business interests had to pay exuberant fees if they wanted to get their own energy sources in the state. So it was really a tough battle. It ultimately failed. The push to deregulate failed. And it was really a similar issue we saw in Arizona. The folks who wanted to keep the utility the same said, look, it's risky to bring in other companies. They won't be state regulated. It could raise your utility bills. And voters went along with that argument.
I mean, just the vast amounts of money that are being spent on these issues. Do you see that sort of continuing, ahead in the 2020 elections and beyond, especially out west?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think Steyer, is trying to take a long view on a lot of these initiatives that you might run it the first time to educate people and then keep going. He did, for example, in Nevada, another issue that passed was similar to Arizona's half their energy from renewable sources by 2030. That passed in Nevada, but under Nevada's quirky laws, it has to pass twice to be adopted. So they'll have a vote on that again in 2020. The folks down in Arizona told me that they could see their renewable issue coming back. So yeah, and I think California has a long history of having all sorts of initiatives on its ballots, and there was one this time regarding rolling back a car tax. I'm sure things like that could return. They tend to energize voters and appeal to specific interest groups. So yeah, I do see them coming back.
Of course, the biggest news, as you mentioned, from the midterms is that Democrats have gained a majority in the U.S. House of Representatives. How could this affect the trajectory of rollbacks of environmental protections that the Trump administration has begun at EPA, even the possible criminal investigation of the Secretary of the Interior, Ryan Zinke?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. I think there's a big impact. I think really riding that wave of suburban angst, and the Democrats did take control of the House last night. They're probably going to have a narrow, maybe 10-seat or so margin. But in the House, that's all you need. You just need a few seats and you control the agenda. And in particular, I think it means that they're going to really increase oversight of the Trump White House. And that means hearings, perhaps into, what EPA is doing or not doing on climate science. It might be looking into some of Interior Secretary Ryan Zinke's travel spending, things like that. And that's an issue that Nancy Pelosi, in her first press conference since they took back the House, repeatedly emphasized oversight and the need for Congress to serve as a sort of a check and balance to the Trump administration. So I think you'll see that. I think legislation, certainly the House Democrats will push legislation on climate change, greater environmental regulations. I'm not sure how much success they'll have with that because the Senate will still be in Republican hands. But what they will be able to do is, whereas when the Republicans controlled both chambers, they were able to move bills, often blocking Obama-era environmental policies, they'll no longer be able to do that. So it will slow down some of the regulatory rollbacks that you referred to.
And how might having new leadership, like newly chaired House committees, like the Committee on Science, Space and Technology, or Energy and Commerce, change things?
I really think that the change will be Republicans tended to focus more on energy issues, and environment and climate change got so much short shrift. I think you'll see a flip. I think you'll hear a lot more talk about environmental justice issues. I mentioned earlier that I think you'll see them establish a climate panel to focus specifically on climate change. And, if you look at the people leading that committee, starting with New Jersey lawmaker Frank Pallone, who's expected to be the chairman, he's somebody who's viewed as an environmentalist. And I think you see a lot of folks that will be in the senior roles on the Energy Commerce Committee viewed as environmentalists, people who are committed on climate change, Superfund, site cleanup type of things. So I think that will be a big change from a lot of the Republicans who are viewed as more tied to the energy industry. On the House Science Committee, the favorite is Edie Bernice Johnson from Texas to take that over. Again, I think what really happened in recent years on that committee is science became a really partisan issue, a lot of questioning of science that we hadn't seen before in the federal government. There's long sort of been a bipartisan tradition of federal science research, but Republicans really began to push back on that, especially as it related to the environment and climate change. I think Democrats will definitely push to allow for funding for that. I'm not sure how successful they will be with the Republicans still in control of the Senate, but they'll raise the issue. And again, I think they'll also raise a lot of questions about Trump's denial of science, particularly on climate change.
I was thinking, what if he said, no, I've seen the hurricane situations, I've changed my mind. There really is climate change. And I thought, wow, what an impact. What an impact that would make.
I'm not denying climate change, but it could very well go back. We're talking about over millions of years. They say that we had hurricanes that were far worse than what we just had with Michael.
Who says that? They say. You mean the
people
people on the phone?
People say that in the...
Yeah, but what about the scientists who say it's worse than ever?
You're on Capitol Hill today, the day after the elections. What is the mood like? Is there a sense of excitement? Is it kind of like meh? Is it?
I think there's definitely a lot of excitement in the House side. I mean, this is the first time in a decade that Democrats won the House. They lost control in the 2010 election. So for a lot of House members, they've always been in the minority. So yeah, there's a lot of excitement about, being in the majority, being able to see their priorities advance. Yeah, I think there is. And I think on the Republican side, there's a lot of fear about being marginalized. But I think there's also a sense that you're going to see some significant clashes in coming months between the Trump administration and congressional Democrats. Trump suggested, he might go to war with Democrats if they push for his tax returns. And you're hearing Democrats saying again and again, we need to be a check and a balance on this administration. So yeah, I think there's excitement, but I think there's also some questions about what lies ahead and what it all means. And of course, we're only 2 years away from a presidential election, so that will color a lot of what goes on in the months ahead.
What issues are you going to be looking at closely or interested in covering over the next year, 2 years?
I think climate change is going to be a big one, with Democrats taking back the House, to see what they do there on that, and if they're able to elevate that issue, if they're able to get the public more engaged on it, and if they can find any bipartisan moves they can make on it. Also, I'm watching infrastructure. Both Nancy Pelosi and Mitch McConnell held press conferences today, the day after the election, and when they were asked, what's the one issue you can work on, both of them immediately said infrastructure, building roads, bridges, waterways, and the such. Infrastructure has really had a long tradition of being a nonpartisan issue on Capitol Hill. Both parties like it because it allows them to bring money home to their states and districts that is very popular with voters. They both say they want to work on it. They both say that it's something they could see happening next year. The Trump White House has also said that, so we'll see where that goes. That will be a big one to watch as well.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me on a busy day.
Okay, thanks for your time. I appreciate it, Kara.
George Cahlink is a congressional reporter with E&E News, which is the go-to place for news about energy and the environment. Thanks for listening to Trump on Earth. I'm Kara Holsopple. Andy Cubis produces the podcast, and Kathy Nauer is our executive producer. Catch up on past episodes at trumponearth.org. And an important reminder, you can support Trump on Earth by going to patreon.com/TrumpOnEarth. We're using the money we raise there for audio production to keep the podcast going. So thanks to all the Trump on Earthers who've given. And thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.